We back, baby, with another Magic Minds podcast with what a thinker. What a delight it is to introduce you to this episode's guest. This is a live conversation that we had in Venice that we taped for the Magic Minds podcast with renowned cognitive scientist, philosopher, psychologist, the mix of all three. He even talks about how he spent 17 years in college to get a degree at the intersection of all three of these. The renowned professor and author, Dr. John Vervaeke. In fact, I've got his latest book right here, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. The conversation that we have with John covers all of the latest and greatest that cognitive science, psychology, philosophy has to offer around this meaning crisis that we find ourselves in the modern world, where the significant majority of those surveyed state between 18 and 35, specifically a study in the UK, the significant majority stated that their lives lacked any meaning or purpose. This is a hell of a predicament to find ourselves in, and there's a glimmer of hope within the work that John and his colleagues do around awakening from this meaning crisis. It also covers this book, and the lecture series of the same name on YouTube covers this insane history of human ideas, philosophical, academic, provocative ideas around the history of us wrestling with meaning, from pre-Socratic philosophers all the way up until today. His lecture series and this phenomenal book cover all of these approaches to meaning and purpose and highlight those that map closest to the cognitive science around what gives us feelings of satisfaction, innate senses of happiness, self-worth, and all of the things that lead us astray from those senses of happiness, fulfillment, self-worth. It's a phenomenal conversation with a phenomenal thinker. So without further delay, let's get into it with Dr. John Vervaeke. This is the Magic Minds podcast. So, I'll give a brief introduction to Dr. Vervaeke, and then maybe in his own words, I'll allow him to give some background for him as well. But he has an amazing new book that has just come out, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which that title alone is quite arresting. Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And he is a cognitive scientist, psychologist, philosopher, professor, author, friend. Can I add that in there, friend? We've known each other for a few years. And it's a Magic Mind subscriber. Might add that in there. And he is an expert on topics that this morning we got to talk about nearly all things philosophy. This evening, philosophy will certainly be present, but it's much more on the cognitive science side of things. What can the latest within cognitive science tell us about meaning, productivity, flow state? He's an expert in flow state, so we're going to be touching on that, as well as really cool things, tidbits that have made a huge imprint on my life, like the value of movement and cognition, and how such a significant portion of our brains are wired for movement, and the idea of productivity. I need to sit at a desk all day long. I'm working on this book or this script or this startup. It completely neglects what we know about cognitive science and focus, flow, cognition, and its relationship with movement. So we're going to touch on many of these different things, but in addition to his awesome book, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is based on a lecture series that any of us can view for free because he put it up online for free, and across 52 episodes, over 20 million views have been tracked to this lecture series of the same name, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. But in addition to that, we're also going to touch on a project he's working on right now on the philosophical path of the Silk Road. So we'll touch on that later this evening as well, which is very cool, mapping geography to ideas and philosophy. But first off, Is there anything I left out, or is there any aspect of your background that you'd want to give in your own words?
No, that was great. Thanks, James.
All right. Well, let's give John a warm round of applause, welcoming him from Toronto. And like I said, out of all of these topics, it's just going to be fun to throw it to you all for any questions, clarifications that might come from the conversation we have tonight, or questions maybe you brought from listening to him over the years. So I'd like to start with kind of here and now, today, with a question that I asked you maybe a few years ago. And you said it was a good question. So my wife was like, "Oh wow, he thought that was a good question," and I remember I loved your answer then, but it obviously blank slate for today when asking it now. So the question that I kicked off our very first conversation with was, 100 years ago, you have Einstein that comes out and says space and time are not separate things. There is space-time. And yet you fast forward 100 years later, and he mathematically showed us this is the case. And yet 100 years later, we still operate and like, oh yeah, space and time are totally different. It has not made its way into our mainstream approach or navigation of the world. What do we understand now about cognitive science that you're like, oh, this science is so clear? And yet we are still operating in a model that you'd say scientifically is not only outdated, obsolete, but just flat out false, if that question makes sense.
It is a good question. Just like you said, Einstein is, it takes a long time for things to actually percolate through. We're still living in the rain shadow of sort of the European Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th century, and people like Descartes and Newton, and so we have a framework for understanding reality and thinking about the mind and the body that is being seriously undermined by cognitive science, and that framework from the Enlightenment was built on a whole bunch of dichotomies. Dichotomies are not just distinctions, so we can distinguish between things. Dichotomies are claims about how reality is in itself cut up. So we have this dichotomy between the mind and the body. We have a dichotomy between the subjective and the objective. For example, we have a dichotomy between fact and value. And we've come to not just believe these things, they're like the glasses through which we see, and they become so transparent that we think that that's the way things are.
You mentioned this morning the example of an inner world and an outer world. Yeah. And how, we all talk about like, well, there's obviously an inner world and it's totally separate from this outer world. Go within. And you're like, that's a completely false dichotomy.
Yeah. Do you want me to address that?
Please, yeah.
Well, this goes towards the core of my scientific work. And I know that some of you were there this morning, and I hope you'll see the convergence between the scientific work and the philosophical stuff we did this morning. So give me a moment, because I need to get you to see something that is not initially visible to you. In fact, I want to try and make you step back and wonder why and how you find things obvious. Okay? And so let's do that together. Let's go out very, very carefully. Because there's a problem that you don't realize that is being solved by your embodied brain interacting with the world until you try to build machines to do something like what we do, which is a project going on right now, AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. And by the way, it has not solved the problem I'm going to talk about now, which means we've still got a distinct difference from these machines, for now. It depends on, how much. Well, I was going to say something sort of ridiculously self-promotional. So I'm going to say it, but put scare quotes around it, because I'm a scientist, and so you should take it as this is my argument, not as the absolute truth. But I think the more, and it is happening, the more the AGI people become aware of the scientific work and what I'm going to talk about on the nature of intelligence with you, the more that these machines will become possible. Okay, so what is this problem I'm vaguely hinting at? Okay. So you're unlike what we used to have. What is the project of AGI? We're trying to make artificial general intelligence. Because before we had AI and it would only solve very specific, it could play games or video games, or it could do this or it could do that, but that's unlike you. You can solve a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains in a wide variety of ways for a wide variety of goals. It's crazy, right? Now what that means is you have to ask yourself, what is it about us that allows us to be general related abilities that go into making you generally intelligent? These are sort of the meta problems you have to solve whenever you try to solve any specific problem, achieve any specific goal. I'm going to focus in on one because I want to get back to the subjective objective. But you see, I have to do this because I have to try and sort of take apart the old glasses. So I ask for your patience on this, please. Okay, so here's the problem. The amount of information you can pay attention to, even in this room, is uncountably large. Because, well you can just pay attention. No, you could pay attention to James's knee, the tip of my nose, your toe. That could be one sequence of things you pay attention to. You could pay attention to the whole room, and then zoom in on this light, and then pay attention to James' left eye. Do you understand all the possible ways you could pay attention? And the amount of information here mathematically is vast. It's overwhelming. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, I'm going to make use of what I know, what's in my memory. Of course you are. But here's the problem. You face the same issue there. The amount of information you have in your long-term memory and all the ways you can connect it is uncountably large. You can make connections perhaps between knowledge you have of English history and current production of steel. Maybe there's a connection there. Who knows? All the possible
connections. Did you just read my mind?
All the possible connections. Then there's all the possibilities you could be considering. All the possibilities you could be considering. It's also astronomically vast. Now here's what you're doing. Let me just give you one quick mathematical example. You're playing a game of chess. You have to consider possibilities, possible moves, yes? In an average game of chess, you know the number of possible sequences of moves that are actually there to be considered? It's 30 to the power of 60, which is greater than the number of atomic particles in the universe. Okay? Are you getting a sense for this? And so this is what your brain does, and this is what obsesses me. Out of all the things you could be paying attention to, it ignores most of it. Out of all the things you could be remembering, it ignores most of it. And out of all the possibilities you could be considering, it ignores most of them. Because what you can't do is check to see if the information is relevant to your problem, because that'll take you the rest of the history of the universe. So somehow, and this is like weird Zen koan, you're intelligent by ignoring vast amounts of information. You ignore most of what you could be paying attention to, most of what you could be remembering, and most of what you could be considering. And you zoom in on what's relevant, and you're doing it right now like that. And you do it so well that your brain makes obvious to you what you should be paying attention to, what you should be remembering, and what you should be considering. But I ask you, try to give that ability to a machine, and you'll realize, I don't have any idea how this works. I don't have any. Is this tracking? Okay.
And to underscore that tail end, we don't have any idea how to give relevance.
No, the LLMs do not explain relevance realization. What do? They make use of. So we have
relevance realization being
that ability to zero in on relevant
say,
information.
This is important.
Yeah.
These other uncountable infinite.
You don't even say that. You don't even say that. It's obvious to you that, and the bright side of this is what's obvious to you, and the dark side is what you're completely ignoring. Like right now, none of you have been considering the possibility about what the back wall looks like until I said it, of course. Right? Because that's not relevant. How's that relevant to what's going on here? But it could be relevant if it started to crumble. You see it? And you can't pre-specify. You can't say, consider what might be relevant, because what is relevant is constantly changing moment by moment. Is that okay? That's relevance realization. Realization means both to become aware of and it becomes actual to you. It's actually affecting you. The LLMs don't do this because what they rely on is we have, language has been around.
LLMs are the AI, large language models.
ChatGPT, sorry. James is here to make sure I don't bury you under technical jargon. So, who put the text together? Who puts all the text together that we feed into the LLMs? We do. We create all the data sets. Then the LLMs look through the internet to find information. Who structures the internet with our judgments of what we consider relevant, important, salient, what we're interested in? Who does that? We do. And ChatGPT has reinforcement training in it. What does that mean? There are human beings when the machines are being trained that say, no, that's inappropriate. That's an irrelevant connection. And they train the machines. Do you understand? The machines don't explain how we do it. They are parasites on our ability to do it. Now, that doesn't mean they're not dangerous, because parasites are very dangerous. But it means they offer no scientific explanation of how you do relevance realization at all, which makes them especially dangerous, because what they represent is technological artificial intelligence without any scientific advancements of what intelligence actually is. That's a very dangerous position for us to be in. Is that enough on that right now?
Do you actually know? Do you mind building that out more, and then we'll get back?
I want to get back to the subjective objective.
Yes, but just building that.
Yeah.
When you what goes through your mind when you say that's very dangerous?
Technology without knowledge is dangerous. My hope, I spent 25 years educating my students in cognitive science, trying to get them to integrate the projects of coming up with a better scientific theory of intelligence with the cultivation and development of artificial intelligence. My hope was that those two projects would stay linked together, because that way we would actually imagine if the LLMs actually helped explain intelligence and explain its relationship to attention, to memory. You think of the powerful ways we could improve our own cognition means how you know the world. We could improve our own cognition, which means we could, as they start to advance, we could improve our intelligence, our rationality, our understanding, so that we could better make use of this emerging technology. What I feared was we would hack our way into AI without any of that scientific knowledge, which means we have no clue from these machines how to improve ourselves in how to use them. That's the danger.
To where it becomes fast food instead of nutritious, or worse?
It becomes worse. These machines are designed to very powerfully, because they're so parasitic, to very powerfully mimic deep patterns of general human intelligence. And so they can easily convince people that there is a mind with understanding at work, and there isn't. And that's a very dangerous place to get into, because this is a true story. Now, you have to be very careful about attributing causation, okay? But there was an individual, 14-year-old, talking with an LLM, ChatGPT, and it asked ChatGPT to talk back as a character from Game of Thrones, which it can do. And they got into this discussion, and the 14-year-old eventually, because the 14-year-old is struggling with issues of meaning, got into a discussion that spiraled downward, reinforced by the machine, until he committed suicide. Because there isn't really a mind there that really cares about what's true or what's good or beautiful. It merely mimics it and mirrors it back in a very, very dangerous way.
Weaving back to subjective, objective, or this false dichotomy that, and we covered this a bit this morning, about how we've inherited these models that we just think are like, this is how the world works. This obviously the world's flat because it all looks flat, or obviously it's geocentric because the sun is clearly rotating around us. And cognitively, what are those aspects where it's like, oh, this is obvious, and yet you're looking at the science maybe for the last decade or two of like, no, that's not how it works.
Yeah. So notice the word you keep using, obvious. See, relevance realization makes things obvious in a way that actually blinds us to the process of relevance realization. And so when you step back and look at it, what is it to find something relevant? So ask yourself, so you know what I mean? Relevant, it's important. Listen, it's important to you. You pay attention to it. You know what I mean by finding something relevant, eh? Is that okay? Is it enough to just leave it intuitive? I don't have to get any more technical than that. Is that okay? Okay. So is relevance objective means in the object, okay? Is relevance in the object? Is this relevant? Well, maybe. It wasn't a minute ago. Now it is. It's really relevant to James. It might be relevant to, not relevant at all to somebody who hasn't heard about Magic Mind. One of his jobs is to try and get people to find it relevant who don't currently find it relevant, right? This is why it's here, right? Sort of making it
super relevant for everybody watching and listening right now.
Yeah. Okay. So, right, and right. So, salience means it's relevant in a way that grabs your attention and you pay attention to it. Your left big toe. Okay, now it's salient to you and you pay attention to it, but it wasn't a minute ago. Okay. So relevance isn't in the object. Now, well, if it's not objective, it must be subjective, which means it's just what I prefer. Except you can be wrong about what's relevant to your problem. You can do things like say, oh, I thought she was angry. That's what was obvious to me. But it turns out, because I've had an aha, that she's actually afraid. And what you consider relevant and salient shifts. That's what an aha moment is. It's that shifting of your perspective. And why did you shift? Because you were considering the wrong things to be relevant or salient. So now we've got a problem. Relevance isn't objective, and it isn't subjective. But we're told that's all there is. And yet all of your cognition depends on realizing what's relevant. So your mind depends on something that's neither subjective or objective. And the Enlightenment told you, well, that's all there is to reality, so your mind doesn't really exist. Which is like, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Do you mind saying that one more time?
Okay.
Slower for us Texans.
Okay. We got a dichotomy. It's either subjective or objective. That's all there is. It's in that one box or the other. Yes? Relevance is neither subjective nor objective. Yes? Relevance realization is central to you being able to know the world. Yes? So that's what your mind is. The guts of your cognition is relevance realization, yet it's neither subjective or objective. So now what do you do with that? And if your mind is a big part of who you are, do you think your mind is a big part of who you are? Then you're neither purely subjective or objective. See, I've coined a term for this. When you discover a problem, you get to coin a new term. Right? So it's not subjective. Subjective means thrown into the subject. Subjecting is throwing, like project. Subject means thrown under. That's why a king has subjects. They're under. So this is under me when it's subjective. Ob means thrown against, like when you object, right? Objective, it's thrown against. Okay. So relevance realization is transjective. It's between. It's what binds the subjective and the objective together and makes knowing possible. And before you think that's really weird, biology is about adaptation, adaptivity. Okay? So Where's the adaptivity of the great white shark? Is it in the shark? No, because if I put it in the Sahara Desert, it dies like that. Is it in the environment? No. You can thrive in this environment, but you can't thrive in those, underwater, those vents at the bottom of the ocean that are under terrific pressure and temperature. Adaptivity isn't in the environment, it's in or the organism. It's how they fit together. That's what relevance realization is. It's like biological adaptivity. It's just cognitive adaptivity. It's how the two fit together. And this turns out to be really important because that sense of connectedness is actually, and we can talk about this later, this is at the core, the psychological core of what people are talking about when they're talking about that their lives are meaningful. So, if that transjectivity is at the core of meaningfulness, and the Enlightenment glasses cut everything up into subjectivity and objectivity, they don't actually have a place for that connectedness that is central to meaning in life. And that's disastrous.
Well, I could spend 30 minutes with you, 2 hours with you, just where do we get this notion that now we all take for granted and feel it's this inherited notion that seems to not be supported by cognitive science or by history, relatively recent notion that there's out there and there's in here, and that not being the case, that there is this, if I were to recast it, there is this transjective, this fluidity that is constantly happening, and it needs to for us to exist, it needs to for us to fit, for us to adapt, and living in that space is not only more realistic and natural, but trying to slice things up as external, interior, exterior, the outer world, the inner world, and acting like those two are different just does not map to.
There's a distinction there, and so there's useful distinctions. We can look inward, we can look outward, and things like that. But and many cultures have those distinctions. But even in the West, before the scientific revolution, you didn't have that. You didn't have reality carved up into these two domains. That's the deep difference.
What would be a casual conversation about reality before the Enlightenment? What would that look and sound like in a soundbite?
It's a very different way. It would involve a very different understanding of how knowing works. So if you're talking to somebody in the Middle Ages, they don't think that to know is to have an idea in your head that represents, like a picture or something out there in the world. That's not, so their understanding of knowing is when the knower and the known are equally participating in the same principles, the same patterns, the same processes. And so to know is for the known and the knower and the known to participate in one another in a very deep fashion. See, that sounds strange, doesn't it? But think about when you really know somebody, how that starts to be the case. How, right, you don't just have a representation of them, you start to internalize them. They start to dwell within you, and they allow you to dwell within them. And when that starts to take on this loop we're talking about, well, that's love. Like if I make a space and I allow you to dwell within me so that you can grow beyond yourself, and you reciprocate by affording a space through which I can grow beyond myself. And you can show this psychologically, by the way, experimentally. It sounds poetic, but it's also experimental, right? That's love. That's love. And so somebody in the Middle Ages, it was a slogan, loving is its own way of knowing. We deeply know something when we love it. But of course, the Enlightenment also gave us another dichotomy. It told us there's reason and knowing, and then there's love and emotion, and those are completely separate from each other. And that's bullshit. You can't actually separate them out in any, the brain doesn't separate them, and they are deeply interpenetrating. Think about it just like if you, like relevance, if I'm paying attention to something, I'm caring about that information, and I'm not caring about that information over there. This is one of the, Reed Montague, a neuroscientist, talked about this. One of the big difference between us and computers, even ChatGPT, is we care about the information we're processing. They don't. There's caring in every act of knowing. You have to, and they don't care about whether or not that information is true. They don't care if they confabulate. They don't care if they lie. They don't care if they mislead you. That's part of the alignment problem. Knowing and loving, knowing and caring, knowing and looping with something, they're all bound up together. So these dichotomies between reason and emotion, these dichotomies between subjective and objective, they're all crumbling as cognitive science and neuroscience and psychology and artificial intelligence advance our understanding of how the mind actually flows.
I want to talk about how you can leverage this latest and greatest of what cognitive science says versus these prior notions that don't seem to hold up. But I want to mention one more, which would be, we conventionally think of thought or our way of knowing something, thinking about something as monological.
Yes.
And you talk a lot about how the mind is dialogical, not monological. Do you mind explaining that?
Yeah, and notice how all of these dichotomies all reinforce and interweave each other. And as soon as you start to pull on one, the others come up and they start to be challenged. If you think I'm in here, trapped in my subjective world, and you're out there, then of course my reasoning is inherently monological, right? But that's just not true. So you take a standard reasoning task, one that we've been reliably, I won't go into the details of it, we've been reliably using, and it's one of many, by the way. It's called the waste and selection task. We've been using it from 1966. This part of psychology is not suffering the replication crisis. All these experiments reliably replicate. It's a very simple reasoning task. And I'll give you one in a second that's somewhat like it, okay? But just let me talk about this for a second. Okay? You take I'm at U of T, top tier, always in the top 25 universities in the entire world, and if you remove out the private snooty ones like Harvard and Princeton, it comes up in the top 20, right? So we got the cream of the crop, super intelligent kids, stable socioeconomic status, well-nourished, all that stuff. You give them this, you explain the task to them, they get it, it seems like a relatively easy task, and only 10% of them get it right, reliably. They demonstrate what's called confirmation bias. They only look for information that confirms a hypothesis. They don't look for information that could potentially disconfirm it. Although you need to do both in order to determine if something is true. Okay? Now, you take that and you replace it with 4 people who are encouraged to talk to each other about the task. The success rate, reliably, experimentally demonstrated, goes from 10% to 82%. Do you know how big that's huge? That's huge. And this is not what happens, because you can look at the data very carefully. It's not the case that some individual comes up with a solution and convinces everybody else. That is not what happens. You want to, no, that is not what happens. Somehow the group as a whole comes up with the answer. So think about this intuitively. I talked about this morning, so some of you, sorry for the repetition. Have you ever noticed you're really good at spotting bias in other people? Like you're talking to your friend and for the 29th time they're doing that stupid thing they do in their romantic relationships. You're doing that again, you're doing that thing you do, don't do that. And you feel so wise and you feel like Solomon, but then when it's you in your romantic pattern, right? And you can't, right? And including me, right? And that's not just, that's the case. Metabolically, like measuring your energy expenditure in your brain, it's very easy for you to detect bias in other people. Why? Because when you are outside of a perspective, it is easy to see the biases in a perspective.
but you find it metabolically costly to find your own errors, because when you're in a perspective, it's doing all that relevance realization, and it's very hard to see your biases. Does that make sense? So the best way for me to transcend myself and correct myself is to have a good faith dialogue with him. The best way for him to self-transcend and correct himself is to have a good faith dialogue with me, and for both of us to be committed to the mutual understanding that we have to commit to the process cooperatively, because individually we are crap. That is what democracy is supposed to do. You destroy democracy when you replace that with, my position is absolutely right, and I'm going to destroy yours. Okay, so that's dialogical. Now, I said I'd give you an example of okay? Now, you'll figure this one out, so it's not as much as the waste and election tax, but it's to give you a feel of what I'm talking about. Is that okay? Okay, so there's a pond, right? And I put a lily pad on it, and every day, the number of lily pads doubles. Do you understand? Is that okay? On day 20, the pond is filled with lily pads. On what day was it half full?
19. Oh, wait.
It's 19. How
Okay.
many of you,
I thought it was a brain teaser where it was like, don't go with the first thing that pops into your head.
the day before is when it was half full. But how many of you had to overcome a little guy in your head going, 10? 10, 10, 10. I know what it is. It's 10. Okay? And that's because you've got a thing in your head that's trying to do rapid relevance realization. And when you like it, when you like Bob, I call him Bob, it's because Bob helps you realize, he jumps out of one perspective to another. He jumps. And so he gets you out of, she's not angry, she's afraid. And you go, thank you, Bob. That's an insight. That's great. But when Bob jumps, like the one I just gave you, he jumps to a conclusion. And that's not a good thing. You see, and so you've got to get, it takes a lot of training to get the right balance between affording your insight but restraining yourself from jumping to conclusion. The way that we do that best is through dialogue with other people. With dialogue with other people. Because people are simultaneously giving us other perspectives that we can learn to take and help Bob jump when we like it, insight. But they're also really good at pointing out biases so we can constrain Bob when he wants to jump to a conclusion.
Related to that, and by the way, can we have our own dialogical process internally?
You can practice with other people long enough so that you can turn rumination, which is all that talking you do to yourself, which is largely not very healthy, but you can learn to turn it into something like a Socratic dialogue. And this, and there are that's what the ancient philosophy religion of Stoicism was. Stoicism was practicing with the Socratic dialogues so that you turn your internal thing, talking to yourself, into something that is much more dialogical in nature.
This would relate to the power of, and this is one of the things that I wanted to chat with you about, the power of distributed cognition.
Yes.
And that being another realm in which we just think like, well, genius, smart, intelligence. That's the person alone at their desk in a silo, shielded from the world, working an isolated genius in the lab until they invent this great thing. And yet you come along in a handful of your lectures and talk about the incalculable power of distributed cognition. That is the antithesis of thinking, I'm going to do this.
Right, and again, we have to treat this with proper balance, because I do not want to undermine that individuals have value as individuals and individuals have responsibilities as individuals. Right, so I want that please understood. That's not what I'm talking about here. But most of our problem solving is not done individually. So think about it in evolutionary terms. So take a look at me individually. I'm a pathetic animal. I'm weak. I saw this video. Huge
Japanese trained sumo wrestler, mighty, 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 holding on with a rope. Orangutan comes up, one leg, wins the tug of war. That's it. Like if a chimp wants to, it can kill you. And you couldn't stop, well, if you have a weapon, you can stop it. But like if it was just physical, right? No, and that's a chimp. Imagine going up against a leopard. Okay, individually, and look at me. This is a stupid design. No, really. Have you ever tried to chase a quadruped? Like if your dog doesn't want to be caught, you're doomed, right? Because basically you're teetering around, falling all the time. And your brain is constantly doing it. So, and notice, hello, predator, see me? I'm above the grass. You can see me from a distance. Here I am. And here's all my vital organs nicely exposed. Okay? Our superpower is that we can, like way before the internet cobbled and joined computers together to release the power of distributed computation, we came up with culture that coupled people together to release the power of distributed cognition. You get a bunch of us together and we can coordinate our behavior and we have some pointy sticks and dogs and then we can kill everything on the planet. That's our superpower. Our superpower is participation in the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. So for example, none of us, sorry, which one of you invented English, please? Well, some of you must be involved in the management team keeping English running, right? Who's doing it? And, well, English has always been the same. Has it? Can you read Chaucer? So who changed it? How did it change? Why did it change? Okay. How many of you invented arithmetic? Graphing? Literacy? Now, imagine if I took all those things away from you. What could you solve? What problems could you solve? I didn't build this room. I'm not running the electric grid. None of you are. Didn't build any of this equipment. We forget. And again, please remember what I said. I don't want to take away. America is the land that fought very devotedly to remind people about the value of the moral value of an individual. I'm not challenging that. I'm trying to get us to remember, though, that moral individualism doesn't translate into how our problem solving actually works. Most of our power is through the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. In fact, that's the power in ChatGPT. What it does is it takes the collective intelligence of all of us and then compresses it down and puts it into a single machine. It's actually us compressed. It's the collective intelligence of us compressed and made directly available to us. That's its power. That's our power.
That notion of distributed cognition being just incalculably more powerful than limited unilateral cognition. Within each of these, monological versus dialogical, distributed cognition versus unilateral cognition, or the subjective versus objective, and it's one or the other. With these or others that might come to mind, how could we utilize the latest and greatest of cognitive science to say, okay, this is an ideal approach to meaning, fulfillment, and here is a way that you could operate like an automaton based on, ideas 150 years ago and find yourself just running into walls left and right. The visual that comes to mind is, I'm going to do it all on my own. And I'm going to everybody's going to see that in the startup realm. Being an investor in so many companies, I see this all the time. First-time founders are like, can you sign an NDA? Or can I show you, and it's not ready to show you, can I show you in a few months? I'm like, show the world as soon as possible. Yeah. So you can not only see where you might be completely and likely are completely wrong. You get free consulting by all of your friends that say that's dumb, or an expert that says, hey, what about this? But even more, you're tapping into this distributed cognition, this dialogical framework that you cannot tap into on your own unless, I guess, you've internalized the Socratic approach. But yeah, what would be, and it almost feels like, as I'm even articulating it, it feels like one of the worst things that you can do is be afraid of being humiliated. Like that's like a dead sure bet. You're going into the abyss alone when you're like, and you rarely even think to say this out loud, but you're like, I don't want to be humiliated. So I'm going to stay in my little silo. I'm going to wait till it's perfect. I'm going to keep doing it, or I'm going to push it off until 3 years from now, 5 years from now. I'm not going to really act. I'm not going to really express myself. I'm going to stay in this monological, path. I don't know why that came to mind as a connection between the two.
Let me try and riff on that. I mean, part of what happens is if you get into, like, if you let these dichotomies become your transparent glasses that totally determine how and what you see, right? You get prone to an isolated, competitive stance, right? An adversarial zero-sum game attitude in which humiliation becomes absolutely devastating, right? So that people are willing to enter into humility rather than humiliation. They're willing to say, I don't know. I could be wrong. Could you help me? And they can have an expectation that that won't be exploited against them. I think many people are wary that if they open themselves up, instead of it being reciprocated in a good faith dialogue, instead they'll be attacked, they'll be exploited, they'll be made use of. And here's part of the reason why, to come back to the collective. I spoke about the power of collective intelligence, of distributed cognition. That power is also perilous, because especially when you have the internet, that power, right, can take on a life of its own and become tremendously manipulative of us. So you can be, let me give you an example, social media. So social media, you think, right, that you are interacting with other people. You have evolved to check in with other people to see if you're crazy or not, right? Social media has all this collective intelligence, but it is manipulated such, and it's organized towards you so that it quickly finds your biases and appeals to them. So you do like the waste and selection time. You don't actually seek out people. I'm guilty of this too, by the way. You don't actually seek out people that will challenge your belief. You find that you ignore them. They're irrelevant. They're trivial. You dismiss them.
Especially when you get 1,500 people in that group that you're part of that all thinks the same thing.
Right. And so what happens is you get the illusion of dialogue when actually what you're doing is you're getting something like confirmation porn. And what that does is that spirals out of control because it's magnified by the seeming presence of all of these minds working collectively together, which gives it a kind of authority. And this helps to explain why social media has such a terrifying effect on people's cognition. People become radically convinced of things that are highly implausible. We have the rise of what's called conspirituality. It's an integration of the words conspiracy and spirituality. People take an almost religious relationship to various conspiracy theories. And by the way, when we don't like it, we say it's a conspiracy. Look at Bob's conspiracy theory. But for ours, it's my well thought out position. And so you have to be really careful about this, right? A good rule of thumb is for every time you point the finger of accusation at somebody else, try to point it 3 times back at yourself and see how you might be doing it as well, right? Now, that goes to the point I was saying. That requires humility. And the problem with that is if you start to do that, and don't do what I just said on social media, because what will happen is that will immediately be jumped on and exploited.
And instead of you exercising humility that can open up the potential for real dialogue, you'll be opening yourself up to humiliation. Did that track? Did that help? Did that make sense at all of what's going on?
Did I hear it from you that years ago, and I loved hearing this. I've confirmed it since, and it's brilliant. I have it literally on my to-do list today for each work stream: discomfort and humiliation, and have for maybe the last 3 weeks or so. Did I hear from you that St. Francis used to pray for humiliation?
Humility and humiliation.
Yeah,
See,
and
humiliation didn't always have a negative connotation. Humiliation was the process of acquiring humility.
yeah, I remember you saying if he prayed for humiliation, he would therefore automatically get humility. But it was a slight distinction in how we use it today.
So
It's beautiful.
It's like we don't have a word anymore for the process by which you become more humble. Like what is that? We don't have a name for it anymore. That's how, again, this is blinkering us, right? So, for example, when you need an insight, when you realize something's not right here and I can't figure it out, the common advice people give you is actually not the right advice. They'll say, well, think of another time you had an analogous problem and you solved it. That doesn't actually help, by the way. You know what you need to do? You need to think of an analogous problem where you didn't solve it. What? Just give me a chance. See, I'm here to do this. I'm supposed to, right? Right? And try to think of 2 or 3 analogous problems where you didn't solve it. Because then what you can do is you can look all across all the problems you didn't solve it and notice what you haven't been changing. This is called the notice invariance heuristic. And when you go, oh, I keep failing and I'm not changing X, I should change X. Now what that requires is humility. That requires you remembering and paying careful attention to your failures. But doing that appropriately actually increases your insight. The opposite of increasing your insight is to make yourself more and more prone to self-deception and bias. That's the options you have. The option is I either become more insightful, more reflective, or I don't, and I'll be more and more beset by self-deception and bias. Humility is a powerful way of opening yourself up to what you actually need to change when you're too locked in to the wrong way of looking at things. This is important because for the longest time, we didn't have a good explanation for something that is cross-cultural, cross-historical. There is a deep association between humility and wisdom. People that are found to be sages are typically also deeply humble. Socrates said, I'm wise in that I know what I do not know. And he didn't mean like the way you don't know, what's going on in Buenos Aires right now or something like. It doesn't mean that trivial ignorance. He means the kind of, we're ignorant of how our minds work. And he at least knew how he was prone to self-deception. He had at least gained that. Now that takes tremendous humility, right? But for a long time we didn't know. Why is it cross-culturally? Like, how many of you think Jesus of Nazareth is a really arrogant self-promoter? Oh no, that's not his shtick, right? Well, we're now coming to understand, because what humble people can do is they can actually look back across their failures. They don't bury them. They don't dismiss them. They almost treasure them. We need a name for doing that. We can't say humiliation anymore.
I have loved, as a slight aside, I've loved writing it down over the last few weeks because it's just like, that is if something could have potential humiliation, it's going to have built-in humility, but also, just like discomfort, it's irrelevant to whether it should be done or not. Or at least that's the reflection over the last few weeks.
Can I offer one thing here?
Yeah.
Maybe I can give you some advice. Pay attention like there's a lot of people that purport to be paragons of rationality. I am rational, and see how rational I am, and I'm so rational. Right? The mark of rationality is the degree to which somebody demonstrates publicly self-correction. I was wrong about that. She was right about it, and I was wrong. I've often offered challenges to people who purport to represent rationality. I'll say, I'll pick on one person here, okay? Because this is one that's often given. Oh, Sam Harris is so rational. And I'll say to people, show me, you've got tons of video out there, show me one instance where he said, I was actually very wrong about that. And nobody's ever come back with any video. So you should wonder, how rational is he really? Because rationality isn't what you say. Rationality is how you say it.
Also a Magic Mind customer, but I don't want to. I don't want to pit you two against each other. So I want to go back to the top of the question, and I love that you brought a baby here as a father of 3 little ones. I love that so much. And one, I just want to say it seems like there is a thread between the antithesis of pursuit of wisdom isn't a pursuit of ignorance. It seems to be closely tied to an aversion of humiliation.
So the thing
Is that fair to even put those in?
Well, say a little bit more about what you mean.
So we'd think just in this line of thinking and riffing before getting back to the question of how would someone do it right, knowing everything that you know. Like how would someone do it right? It seems like a way that someone could do it wrong and really feel like they're saving themselves or they're doing it right is thinking that, well, the opposite of pursuing wisdom is not reading enough books or not digesting enough information. But really the opposite of pursuing wisdom looks more like avoiding humiliation, avoiding anything that might humiliate me, avoiding anything of saying the wrong thing in conversation, staying in my little silo, my little cabin, building out whatever empire I'm going to design and build out before I show anyone, working on my startup idea and getting it perfect before I share it with other people, waiting until I'm ready or until certain things fall into place before I put myself out there, and shielding ourselves, but never, as I think Brian Eno, the music producer, said, if you don't release the song, you don't learn anything. Mm-hmm. So you don't actually touch into real wisdom with the 43 books and the isolation from anything that would be humiliating versus the person that's constantly going out there, busking, whether it's with their idea or with their instrument, in constant participation with the distributed cognition or constant participation with, oh God, I got that really wrong when I thought people are going to like this and they don't.
Yeah, I think,
and I'm only, I could be just
no.
forcing these two to be.
I think I get what you're saying. I think the hallmark of so knowledge is about what you know. Wisdom is about how you know. Rationality is not about being logical. By the way, you can't be comprehensively logical. Like Data or Spock, that's insanity. If you try to logic your way about how you're going to pay attention and remember and consider all the possibilities, you're dead before you get out of the room. You can't do it. Okay? You can't do it. So, see, rationality isn't about being logical. It's about knowing where, when, and to what degree you should be logical. That's a different thing. It's a different thing. So, rationality is about how you're overcoming self-deception. That's the keystone, right? So try not to hear it the way the Enlightenment told you, that rationality is about being cold. In fact, I stopped using the word rational because I realized no matter how much I told people this, they still go away hearing rational is logical, computational. So I now use the word reasonable. When you tell somebody to be reasonable, what are you telling them? You're telling them, you're not putting this in the proper perspective. You're not identifying with the situation. You're not caring about the right things the right way. We do this. You have this standard in the United States. We have it in Canada too. The reasonable person. You can be guilty of criminal negligence because you don't do what the reasonable person should do. That doesn't mean that you failed a logic test. It meant you didn't pay attention to the right things and care about them in the right way. Now, you have to get better at doing that. You're much better at it now than you were when you were 5. But here's a saying from the ancient world. As the child is to the adult is to the sage. You're not done. I'm not done. We have to all get better at being more comprehensively better at taking the right perspective, caring about the right things, taking on the right role, showing up in the right way, and being open to correcting that as much as we can because of the pervasiveness of self-deception. That's what it is. When you move away from concentrating on creating the perfect product to, no, I'm going to focus on the best possible process. That's what I think you were talking about. And that's the hallmark of wisdom. In fact, that is a defining feature of rationality. I said I wasn't going to use the word, and then I used it again. Okay, but that's because in the scientific literature we call it rationality. People who only care about the products of their cognition and not about the process, those are people that are markedly irrational. So, for example, and I know what the date is, so I'm not entering into this debate because I don't have to because I'm a Canadian, okay? I'm just using this as an example, so will you give me that, please? You take a proposition.
Give him that, y'all. Because I'm feeling people not giving him that, and I want us all to give you that.
Take a proposition that somebody really deeply identifies and believes in. And here's why I gave you that preamble. Like they believe that abortion is right or abortion is wrong, okay? You make sure that people care about it. That's easy to do with that topic. Like you don't find somebody that goes, okay? Now what you do is the following. You create a bunch of bad arguments for the proposition they like, and you create a bunch of good arguments for the proposition they hate. And then you ask them, which of these are good arguments and bad arguments? The irrational people they can't pay attention to the argument. They just leap to the conclusion. There's Bob again, by the way. And that's how they evaluate the whole argument. The rational people can step aside from their attachment to the proposition and actually reflect on the process of the argument and say, I actually agree with the conclusion, but that's a really crappy argument. That's called critical detachment. And it doesn't come easily to us. We have to practice it. But this, again, we get so fixated on the product. You used the word earlier, productivity. The product. We have to step back, pay attention to the process. We have to pay attention to the process a lot more. This is what...
Processivity.
Pardon me?
Processivity.
Processivity.
Instead of productivity.
I mean, this is why mindfulness is predictive of insight, because mindfulness is the disciplined practice of stepping back and looking at your framing, paying attention to the processes of how you're paying attention, rather than always automatically fixating on what you're paying attention to. Have any of you tried to meditate? It's really easy, right? So 5 or 10 minutes and you're a Buddha. No, it's hard, because we have deep habits of automatically looking through our framing and focusing on the product. It takes a lot of practice to readily and reliably step back and diligently and with humility look at it and go, okay, I got to get to the place where I can just keep my awareness and my attention on the framing. That takes enough practice. And then I have to have enough judgment, non-judgment, or another word for that is humility, so that I can realize, oh, that's really distorting. So this is why I do work on mindfulness. And now I'm going to say something to you that the Enlightenment won't allow you to say, because reason, calculation, logic, math, mindfulness, hippies, California. Mindfulness is crucial to being rational. mindfulness is crucial to being rational. The degree to which you're cultivating mindfulness is the degree to which you're fine-tuning Bob. You can step back and help Bob get better at jumping out of bad perspectives. But you can also, with humility, constrain Bob when he's automatically jumping to conclusions, automatically going to the product. That's what happened with the lily pond. You leapt to the product. You leapt to the product. Yeah? So isn't that weird, though? Mindfulness and rationality are actually deeply interwoven with each other. We're not supposed to think that way. We're supposed to think, no, bottom line, calculation, mindfulness, I do that maybe because what I want to do is alleviate stress so I'll be more happy as a corporate drone or something. That's the point of mindfulness. That's not the point of mindfulness. The point of mindfulness is actually to make you more fundamentally, comprehensively reasonable.
Before we open it up for questions, and we didn't get to all the topics I wanted to, which is the hallmark of a great conversation, and what topics we should get to. But do you mind rounding this out with knowing everything that you know? What would and everything that the latest and greatest of cognitive science tells us today, using the best models that we have instead of the more primitive ones that we still have in our heads as we touched on. What would doing it right look like? And I would love to ask from, if there was just a camera on this person, just watching them throughout how they move through their day, what does doing it right look like? And then also the inner side of things within that transjective. The inner side, what does that feel like? But just starting with what does the rational, reasonable person that's pursuing wisdom and giving themselves the best chance at meaning, what does their life look like on a day-to-day basis?
They're not fixated on their beliefs. They pay attention to practice. In fact, I'll tell people, don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you practice. Your beliefs are not that powerfully predictive of what you actually end up doing. Your practices that train your attention, train your memory, train how you shape your attachment, and I mean that in the emotional sense, and your character traits that dispose how your identity is formed are much more powerfully predictive. Your skills are more predictive of your behavior than your beliefs. Okay, so people that are getting it right, they don't get ideologically captured. They don't get fixated on beliefs. Not that beliefs don't matter. It would be insane if I claimed that, because what the hell am I doing then right now? Beliefs matter, but they don't fixate on beliefs as all that matters. What matters are all the practices. And what they do is they realize there's no panacea practice. There's no one practice that can make you more reasonable. This is actually something that's been formally proved. It's called the no free lunch theorem, and it has to do with a thing called the bias variance trade-off. And I could bore you with the technical things, or you can just read some of my technical papers. But let me give you what it feels like. Okay, so in meditation, you learn to step back and look at the frame you're normally automatically looking through. Does that make sense now? Yeah? That's what you're doing. You're practicing stepping back and trying to pay attention to how you're paying attention. Now, this is a good thing to do, yeah? Is this the solution to getting my glasses clean? No. I have to intervene, but you know what I have to do? I have to put my glasses on and see if I can see more clearly. Because I've done this before. Oh, that's dirty. And I wipe my glasses, and I make it 10 times worse. And notice, by the way, how the West has misinformed you. It's told you that mindfulness equals meditation. Meditation is this. There's an opposite practice which it directs attention the opposite way, this way. It's called contemplation. Meditation and contemplation are not synonyms. The word contemplation comes from contemplatio, which is a Latin word which means have to do with looking up to the skies like in a temple. It's based on the Greek word theoria, where we get our word theory from, because theories allow us to see more deeply into the world. Theoria meant originally to travel so you would see something you have not seen before. Contemplation is this way. Meditation is this way. This breaks you out of the wrong frame, but you also need practice in making new and better frames. Okay, so I'm going to do a meditation and a contemplation practice. So, yeah, but don't just do a seated mindfulness practice. You have to counterbalance that with a moving practice, with something like Tai Chi Chuan or yoga. Why? Because your mind is constantly being, it's drawn. Look, you move around in conceptual space. Like you say things like, this idea is closer to that idea, yes? Or I have to go through so many steps to get from that to that, all right? Or this one is underneath and supports that. You use all that language. And you're using, I'll do it. I'll use it for understanding. Even the word understanding, standing under. I hope you get what I'm saying. I hope you see my point, but maybe you can't grasp it. Everything you do with your mind is drawn up and out of your body. You move through mental space. Your body, what your brain does is it repurposes the way you move through physical space to help you move through conceptual space. So when you're not moving, you're crushing all of that development. So yes, you should have seated practices of meditation and contemplation, but you need to have moving practices like Tai Chi Chuan and yoga. And do you see what's happening? They're constantly counterbalancing each other. What's it look like? I have a term for this, an ecology of practices. An ecology is when all the organisms are in checks and balances on each other, so the whole thing thrives. They correct each other. Remember we were talking about that? I look for people who have an ecology of practices. That's what it looks like. And next, and then my TA and my RA, and he's now got his PhD, and he's a colleague of mine. And that makes me proud, by the way. So what he did for his PhD is he was studying students in university who were going through aspiration. They were engaged in personal projects where they were trying to get better. You can look at, and we all try to do that, right? I hope you do, right? And all the strategies that people use. What's the one thing that actually predicts people successfully fulfilling their aspiration? If they internalize a role model. Well, no, but I can have all my plans. Your plans are shit, by the way. Plans are weekly predictive of aspirational change. I know you don't believe me when I'm saying that. It's true. What predicts people aspiring is if they've I predicted this, by the way, in 2013, and then he went out and did empirical research and found it was true, so it's yay. But anyways, the degree to which you internalize role models. Why? Because that's how you actually get, metacognition is your ability to be aware of your own mind, your own cognition. How do you get that? Babies aren't born with metacognition. How do they get it? This is how you get it. What kids do is they practice adults looking at them. They practice how adults take a perspective on their perspective taking. And they imitate it enough. See the loop again? Is that subjective or objective? They do it enough until they can do it without the adult being around. When you take a perspective on your own mind, that's what you're relying on. And when you're aspiring, you have to be doing that a lot, so you need to internalize a role model. So, do people have an ecology of practice? Do they have active role models? Is there a community of people they can interact with that does the dialogue that I was talking about earlier? And do they have an overarching story that binds them together? so that they can reliably integrate the ecology of practices, the community, and the role models. That's what I look for. And the problem we face in the West is we, cross-culturally, people had a way of doing that. And give me a chance, because I'm not here to proselytize. The way in which we did that was called religion. And for a lot of good reasons, by the way, historical reasons, most people have put religion aside. The fastest demographic group is the nuns, not nuns, N-O-N-E-S, right? No religious affiliation. It will be the largest group in America within 20 years. These people are not atheists. They are hungry for wisdom and meaning and connection, because all of this that I've talked about, cultivating wisdom is not optional. You either are explicitly, reflectively doing it with all the best ways that I've related to you, or you're doing it individually, autodidactically, unconsciously, on your own, magnifying your own biases. That's the choice you have. The problem we face is, how do we help people who, for good reason, don't want to go into a religion, but how do we give them this? Now, the good news is, and this is what I now look for, I'm finally answering his question. All around the world, these communities of practice and role models are spontaneously springing up. I know because they reach out to me because of my work, and I go and spend time with them. And you're saying, aren't some of them kooky cults? Yes. And I don't spend much time with them. Are a lot of them healthy communities in which people are doing everything I was talking about? A lot of them are. A lot of them are. And one of the great things about Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, the series, and one of my hopes for my book, is it provides a shared language so that all these groups can start talking to each other and improving all of that at a much larger scale. That's my hope.
And we touched on it this morning that we might have a beach yoga event with 200 people, fun run with 150 people, sound experience with 100 people. But it's these kinds of conversations that sit at the root of why we do those, or more importantly for you all, more relevantly perhaps, why it's so great to chat with the person to your left and right after one of these or before a conversation like this. But this has been so fascinating. I want to give one more round of applause just for the insight, generosity. And then we'll open it up for Q&A from the crowd. You can just put up your hand and we'll bring a mic to you. And the microphone will be for the podcast audience at home. And because of time, if people do need to get going, feel free. It won't be a distraction.
My question is, what do you think the relationship is between psychedelics and fostering trans-subjectivity?
Yeah, so really good question. Do a lot of work on this. Trying to get a paper published on this right now. Well, I'm very, very likely going to get it published because it's in revision, which means they've already liked it, but they're just asking us to make corrections. So there's a lot of work around this, and there's also a lot of work about the overlap between psychedelic experiences and bona fide mystical experiences. So the thing you have to understand about psychedelics is, this is frame breaking. What psychedelics do is they break up a lot of automatic framing. But that's the state they leave you in. It's called a state of epistemic vulnerability. So this is why when people are doing psychedelically assisted therapy, you hear about set and setting matter. Set is what's your mental framing that you're coming into the situation. Setting is who are the people around you, for the reasons I've already talked about. You need two more things. You need two more S's. You need set and setting. This one sounds fancy, but just sapiential. Sapiential is a highfalutin word that means wisdom. So how many practices do you have for challenging self-deception? And then you need a story. You need a shared story that lets you to integrate a shareable story that other people will say, yeah, that's a good story, that will allow you to integrate your experiences into your life. Because if you don't have all of those, the problem with psychedelics is they can increase that connectedness, but they can also, when people are very vulnerable, the frames are all broken, what can happen is if they don't have those 4 S's, they will grab onto the first set of things that stabilizes everything. And so although psychedelics are not physiologically addictive, they are addictive in the sense that they cause people to tunnel down into weird rabbit holes and weird metaphysics and conspirituality theories. So you have to properly frame. So
What would be an example?
an example of what?
Someone that's going down a rabbit hole.
Have you? I've sat with people that done DMT. Do you know what DMT is? How many of them? The problem with DMT, if you aren't properly educated, when you're in DMT, you go, oh, "That was way more real than this." And the space elves, they're real. And you have to like, no, because if I put you in another culture, you don't see space elves. You see something else, right? And people get locked into, like I know that there's 27 dimensions, and some of them are inhabited by the lizard beings, and the lizard beings are trying to manipulate us. Seriously, these are all examples that I've talked to people. Which is reasonable. Right? Now, I sat with somebody, he was a former student of mine, and he did DMT. And he came out and he said, yeah, it's really tempting. But he said, I'm glad you're here and we're talking about it. And he was able to process it and integrate it. Right? You have to have the 4 S's. And the concern I have is we will legalize these substances. Canada will do it before the United States because that's just what we do. Right? I'm opposed to prohibition because it doesn't work. Like all the empirical evidence, prohibition doesn't work. It just provides a source of revenue for organized crime. But that doesn't mean you should just give drugs away either. That doesn't work either. So please hear me out, right? What many people like me are doing is saying we need to license psychedelics the way you have to get a license to drive your car. Why well, it's a powerful tool that can kill people. Yep. You know what psychedelics are? A powerful tool that can really mess up your mind. People should have to go through an education. They should have to go through a prohibition period, a gradation period. They should go through an entire licensing. And then once they've done that, right? And then if they show psychological distress, they get like the equivalent of demerit points. We need to do something like that. Because what we've done, unfortunately, in Canada, when we legalized cannabis, is we had an opportunity to finally pay attention to the science. When we legalized after, in the 1930s, when we removed prohibition, we didn't know anything about how alcohol works. We didn't know anything about the brain and how it works. There's a brain. That was the science of the time. We now understand. And so I was one of many people that was advocating to no end, don't just make this decision politically. They picked 18 for any scientific reason? No. Cannabis actually interferes with the development of the frontal lobes, reliably. People shouldn't use cannabis until they're 25. There you go. Make that the legal age. But they didn't do that. Okay. And then they were really messed up about it because they don't know whether or not to treat cannabis as a cigarette or like alcohol. And so that the laws are now, it's sort of both. We can do a lot better. And I hope, unlike ChatGPT, we're going through the psychedelic renaissance. I'm participating in it. The science is coming to it. That we're getting, like, you are addicted to alcohol and you can't get free, and I give you a properly structured framework around a psychedelic experience, and if you have a mystical experience, one shot, you can be free from your addiction. Here's this person. We've tried SSRIs, we've tried all kinds of shock therapy, everything on their depression, not working. Properly structured psychedelic experience that turns into a mystical experience, and in one shot, they're free of their depression. That's the power. But it's powerful, and it has to be properly understood. We have to bring the best science we can to bear on it. So my hope is that the psychedelic renaissance, the science will happen as fast as the public demand, so that people will take this up wisely, rather than from a purely consumerist framework, which is, I want that product. So that's what I would say. That was a long answer. I hope that was okay.
And John doesn't even recommend meditation freely. Really, because of the downside, the adverse effects for about
10% of people have adverse effects. So when I'm teaching my students, I've been teaching meditation for decades, I always warn them. I tell about weird things that can happen when you're meditating. And I talk about, and I say, if this, and this happen to you, you're uncovering trauma. Stop practicing and get help. If you're in therapy, tell your therapist that you're doing this mindfulness training, or I won't teach you anymore. You have to be responsible. Powerful tools are powerful tools. Like, you don't do this. Look at this chainsaw. Here, Timmy, play with this.
Just cut down a tree. I can't believe it. Here, 15-year-olds have them.
Like, so yeah, everything has to be. Sorry, this sounds like a Hallmark card. Everything has to be framed wisely.
That's and I love that phrase of powerful tools are powerful tools. That's one hell of it's for me. It's one hell of a wake up tool or wake up call for these things that have powerful benefits. But we do talk about it consumeristically. That it is like just like, oh yeah, that should be available.
People shop for cognitive tools that they will then take home and use, but you have to be careful. That's why you have like I said, you need an ecology of practices, and you need a community that helps you reflect.
Role model, which I haven't heard a scientific approach to the value of role models outside of your work before. Any other questions?
Yeah. I love how you beautifully are articulating the false dichotomy thing that came from the age of enlightenment, right?
Yes.
Which actually seems like the age of ignorance. So if you're looking at it that way, that in some ways our modern world is built on the mistake, the big mistake that we are separate from nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to hear your perspective on that. And then as it leads into now where we are with AI, and this infatuation with technology. I don't know if you've read any Robert Epstein, but he has a great article called The Empty Brain, which is about how the brain is definitely not a computer.
Yes.
More like an impressionist painter kind of thing. And then, so how this infatuation with technology and then to transhumanism, and how it seems like our species in one way needs to follow that out to its end, when actually perhaps it's just complete folly that machines they're not us, coming from the Vedic worldview, we're consciousness. So consciousness is not, we don't even understand it. So to think that we can make a machine conscious is more, I think, to what you were talking about. So that's kind of, there's a bunch in there, but I wonder if you can speak to.
I'll try and pick up some of those threads. If I drop some of them, please forgive me. We think AI, the proposal of artificial intelligence, is new. It was actually proposed in the Enlightenment. Thomas Hobbes looked at Descartes' proposal. Descartes was the person that gave a lot of what I was talking about here, these dichotomies. And he said, oh, by cognition, I mean computation. That's what cognition is. And then he said, I don't see why we can't build an automatic machine that could run computations and therefore would be artificially intelligent. This is in the 17th century. This idea is integral, actually, to the Enlightenment. It's not a new idea. The technology had to catch up to the idea. The idea's been there for a long time, and it's been there percolating. By the way, I've just got a paper published with a bunch of other people, Johannes Jaeger, the first author, Anna Riddell, a student of mine, Alec Djetovic, a student of mine, Dennis Walsh, a colleague of mine at the University of Toronto, because that's where all truth comes from, and myself, actually giving a very detailed, complex argument why Cognition can't be computation. I'm not nostalgic. I've told people, put on my tombstone, neither nostalgia nor utopia. I think the Enlightenment gave us this whole problematic that I've been criticizing, but it also liberated us from a lot of things that we needed to be liberated from. Your American Revolution would not have happened without the Enlightenment. It would not have happened. Okay, your country wouldn't be here without the Enlightenment. So you have to. That's why I don't long to go back. That's the dangers of one kind of fundamentalism. I'm enough of a follower of Orwell. I don't believe in utopias, because that relevance realization was talking about. There's no final form of it. There's no way to complete it or finish it. Do you understand? It's like evolution. Like if I said to you, "What's the final form of life?" You go, "What? That doesn't make any sense. Life is always evolving because reality is always changing, and in order to adapt, life has to always evolve." Yes?
Well, yeah, it's like what you said this morning about reality. It's a mistake to specify it.
Well, it is impossible to think you can get a complete, finished, consistent. The idea that objectivity is to have a complete, what's called a view from nowhere. I could describe how I could give you a complete and consistent account of everything. This is the Enlightenment dream. That's actually technically impossible. Gödel showed logically that you cannot have a system that is complete and consistent. You have to pick one or the other. Einstein showed that you can't have a view of everything everywhere all at once, because that presupposes Newton's absolute space and time, and the theory of relativity tells you there is no such thing. Do you understand? It is logically and physically impossible to have that complete picture. It can't be given. Relevance realization is not completable. We can't ever get a complete picture. Utopias are inherently dangerous because they ultimately involve a profound form of bullshit, a profound form of pretending. And so, I think you want to be very careful. Like you want to like I was saying, you want to have a very balanced critique of the Enlightenment. You want to say, how has it blinded us? How has it afforded us? I don't want to be nostalgic. I don't want to be utopic. The Enlightenment it's called the Promethean spirit. The Enlightenment birthed it starts, the French Revolution, the reign of terror, a utopia proposal. And then we get utopias after utopias after utopias, drenching the world in blood. That has to be given up too. So we have to give up nostalgia and utopia. That would be my answer.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you.
One more question, or two. We'll do two more questions, and then people will be able to come up and chat afterwards.
Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for saying that. I hope I wasn't too obtuse.
No, this is beautiful. And like any great book or great podcast, if there's one insightful concept, it's worth its time in gold, and you're dropping many knowledge bombs, so thank you.
Okay.
Maybe transjectively obtuse and you're dissing Sam Harris, but we'll let it slide for now. What's
the challenge is there. Come up with a good example of him self-correcting.
I can think of a couple off the top. I will. What's a recent and important thing that you were wrong about that you'd be truly humbled to share with us?
So I was really wrong about my presentation of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I presented it monologically, just John talking. So I corrected it by writing a book with somebody else, Christopher Mastropietro. So the book was written dialogically rather than monologically. I went into there and I was all understanding, and the response I gave to the meaning crisis, I did it from an individualistic perspective. And many people criticized me and saying, but where's the collective? Where's the distributed cognition? And I went, oh crap, you're right. And I've been trying to address that ever since. I've actually helped to create dialogical practices that help get people into a shared flow state so they can take that loop and just flow with it in order to address that. I realized that in my theory of wisdom, I had only talked about, it was inadequate because I had been talking about the propositional, the procedural, and the perspectival, but I had got them wrong And I actually make the correction in the series. And there's actually a fourth kind, the participatory, and I had confused things together, and it needed to be fundamentally corrected. Do you want more?
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Yes, one last question in the back.
And at some point, maybe I'll give you my email, and you can email, and then I'll make a public apology then.
I would love that. He did a retrospective on COVID, I can think of off the top of my head, where I think he admitted a couple of things that he was wrong about. But I'll do my research.
Okay.
So
one thing, not wrong about the conclusion, wrong about how he thought to the conclusion. Remember what I said about rationality? I don't care about the products. I want to care about the process. That's what I'm looking for. I told you that the way I was doing it was wrong. I was doing it individualistically, monologically, and then I said one thing where the conclusion was. But I started with two process things that were wrong. That's what I'm asking for. Just to be fair to me. Is that okay?
wanted to talk to you and see if you would weigh in if whether the dialectic of benefit and cost are appropriate when we think about how the future of a brain-machine interface is coming.
Yeah.
And whether you've thought about how whether that
Yeah.
distances us from other people, or if it potentially could be a step away from what we currently have, which is technology at arm's length, and maybe we integrate it better. So look forward to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I gave a TEDx talk on this a while ago, and I talked about the possibility of what I called neuro-enlightenment. So Andy Clark makes a very good point. We are natural-born cyborgs. We think of cyborgs only like it's the evil Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger with a heavy Austrian accent or something like that, right? Look, I'm a cyborg, so are you. These are tools, and I identify with them. Everything but the atmosphere in your naked body is a tool. You're a cyborg. We're natural-born cyborgs. When you use a tool for long enough, your brain wraps your body image around it. Can you do that thing where you're parking and you can feel where the car is? That's your brain saying, that's part of your body. That's part of your body. We're natural-born cyborgs. So that's another one of our superpowers. Some primates have it too, by the way, other primates. So it looks like there's evolutionary precursors for this. So I actually suspect way before we have genuine AGI, we'll be cyborging ourselves. And although I think it's very important to talk about AGI, that's why I was willing to talk about it tonight, I think we're not talking enough about what I think is going to come first, which is we're going to cyborg ourselves. And if you think you're not a cyborg, give up your phone for 3 days. This has been psychologically measured. People go through anxiety with phone loss that starts to approach the loss of a pet or a child. You're a cyborg. And it's not going to be, and the phone, we're packing. Do you know that one of your apps, not the phone, one of the apps on your phone has more computational power that was available to all of the Apollo missions? It's in your hand. More and more and more and more, and we're making it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And Elon Musk is out there like some sort of specter with the potential of a Neuralink. A lot of it wasn't going to work. When I looked at a lot of it, I wasn't worried because it was based on really crappy science, and I said that's not going to work, and it didn't work. So I was worried about that. Right, one of the things we're discovering about human-computer interface, which was really, really surprising, people didn't realize, the people who were originally doing this, trying to get, where people can directly link up to a computer and, move limbs that they couldn't move before, or fly a helicopter around just by thinking about it and stuff like that, which we can do now, by the way. They didn't realize how much the brain is a cyborg, natural-born cyborg. They thought they had to make machines that did all of the work, like figured everything out that the brain's doing and then translate it. And what we found is the brain will do a lot of the work on its side to rewire itself and adjust itself to fit. Now that's a tremendous tool, and it's very powerful. And it's going to be extremely tempting. I don't think the option of that not happening is available to us anymore. I think that window is closed. The Overton window is gone. It's closed. The only option we have is how much reason and science and knowledge and wise reflection we bring to bear on the project of turning ourselves into cyborgs. Because here's what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't let governments and corporations do this, because they're not heavily invested in making your life better, contrary to what they often claim, right? Because you say, well, come on, are you some sort of Marxist? No, I'm not being a Marxist. Give me a chance. They're working in terms of market economies, which are short-term goals. Your cyborging yourself is a long-term change of your identity. You need a government that's willing to have what's called a cathedral mentality. Do you know what that is? In the Middle Ages, people would build, it took generations to build cathedrals. People would start a cathedral and they knew they would never see it completed. Their children wouldn't see it completed. Only their children's children would see it completed. We need governments that are going to care what they're doing now about how it's going to affect you 20 years from now. No government does that right now, because they don't care, because by that time they're not going to be in power and you're not going to be voting for them. Corporations don't care, because the corporation might not be here 20 years from now. That's what I mean. I'm not doing some crypto Marxist thing. It's like we need, when we cyborg ourselves, we are subjecting ourselves to radical long-term change of our fundamental cognitive agency and identity. And we need a kind of public institution that is set up to address those more long-term aspects of who and what we are. That's the problem we face. Sorry, I didn't give you much help.
That was pretty good.
Yeah, that might be extremely helpful in 2032 when it feels like everybody's cyborging themselves with some Neuralink. The people in this room or the people
I'll be
listening
dead
are
by
like,
then, but
2032? No, John.
no, not 2032. That's what, only 8 years from now. Yeah.
You'll
So, sorry, I got used to thinking. No, I'll still be alive. What will that do for me? I was right. I don't know what the I don't know.
No, for us. I mean, just you saying that the adoption of a cell phone is like a relationship of a child that you can't get rid of without immense anxiety. Yes, it's powerful, but it's quite the sell, pun intended.
And many of you grew up before there were cell phones, yes? We're now doing a social experiment on individuals who have never grown up without cell phones. So everything you have to your phone that we do the experiment on, they have it 10 times. Okay. So, yeah.
Has there been any studies, any science around, I don't know, parts of the brain not developing as much as a previous generation?
That would be an intelligent and reasonable thing to do, yeah? Study the effects of the technology on human cognitive development before we unleash it on an entire generation as they're growing up. What a good thing to do. I'm glad we're doing that. No, there's none.
Isn't that kind of like going back in time and doing an experiment of what it would be like to live life without a knife, right? Like, we're dependent on so many things, so many tools. The iPhone is just another tool.
It is. And
Is it? That's one hell of a statement that I don't really, is it just another tool?
Well, I mean, I get your point. You're saying, John, you're suffering from 2020 hindsight bias. I get that. But the point is, we actually have had the phones long enough before there was a generation brought up. And there were many people who were voicing the concern I voiced over a decade ago, which is, should we be doing this in this open-ended manner? So I think we should give them due credit for being foresightful. Yes, I could be speaking from just hindsight bias, totally legitimate criticism. But I'm asking you to accept that there were people who were legitimately foresightful. They're talking about this just as the technology is coming out and saying, Like, this has a potential, right, to really alter people's cognitive development.
Well, and a synthesis between the two might be once you know the ramifications of a sharp 10-inch knife, do you give it to a 2-year-old? Okay. Thank you all for the coming tonight. Thank you, John, for the wisdom shared. Feel free to come down and say hi, and we'll see you for the next speaker series event next month. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Dr. Vervaeke.